Right, I've had a request on how I go about my welding, so I'm just going to show you with a little scrap piece of metal. I'm not doing any patches at the moment, but I'm sick of beating the crap out of that thing to get it straight, so I'm going to lay off and show you how I do this. First thing, set up your welder properly. This is a SIG weld transmig that I bought a wee while ago and slowly getting the hang of it. I usually have it set on low 2. You have to play around your own welder to see what your settings are, but usually the second to lowest level, probably the one you want. And wire speed here is, for my one anyway, is 3.5, but whatever it is for yours. Full trial and error, so set second to lowest heat and then play around with the wire feed until you get a good sizzle. Gas. Now, gas is one of the most unknown parts about MIG welding. Lots of people doing panel steel will say you can't go part, you have to use Argo Shield. I say bollocks. This is CO2. It's the same stuff that pours your beer, and it works perfectly fine for me. It does take a bit more practice to get used to, but I'm all for it. It costs a third of what the Argo Shield is, and I own my own bottle. I don't have to pay rental. Check what settings you have them set on. When I bought this, the guy had played around with the settings for me and set up where he thinks that you should be running it. This is an argon gauge, but it works the same as anything, and this is set about 8 litres per minute. Don't try, even though you can run it a bit more to cool the weld down, you don't really want to do that because you'll cool it down too much and it won't start penetration. And I find having it between about 8 or 9 gives me the best performance. So let's take a look at what we're welding. Okay, first thing I always do before I'm coming across a new piece of steel, always give my tip a bit of a clean out, clip off any dags that are at the end of your wire, and just make sure that there's not a lot of splatter around there that can impede my gas flow. Give it a wee push, you should be able to hear the gas flow and the wire feed out. By the way, this is 0.6mm wire that I use. I've got 0.8mm, but I like using that for the heavier stuff. Now, this is probably a situation that you're never ever going to come across the way I've got it held in position here, but this is just for teaching purposes. You never usually have such a nice position to clamp your new bit of steel into where you're running your patch. And you just got to play around with what you use at the time. Sometimes you can get away with some clamps, sometimes you've got to use the wee magnetic strips to hold them in between, whatever works. And on it, several occasions you just basically got to hold your new patch panel in, tack it with the welder so you can get it to hold, and then you can run the rest of your bead. It's just the way it is. Okay, I like to have my wire about 1 centimetre out from where the tip is. When you go to run, this is one of the wee tricks I've learned with running CO2 gas. When you start your first initial part of the weld spot, give the weld tip a little bit of a push. Increase the speed that weld is going into, and then it will initially create a very hot weld, and you'll get instant penetration straight off the bat. You won't have it beating up and blowing across and splattering everywhere. And splatter is an example of where your weld is far too cold, or of course the opposite is where you're running far too high a weld speed, but you'll be able to identify that with practice. So this is how I come across it. Usually you want a gap that's slightly thinner than what your welding wire is. So this is probably slightly thinner than your welding wire. I've got a case here where the gap's a bit thicker. Occasionally you might cut the new patch in incorrectly, and I'll show you a good method to account for that. So I'm just going to go straight ahead and I'm going to make my tacks and show you what I'm doing. So first initial tack, put the wire right where the centre of the hole is, give it a wee push and pull the trigger just for a moment. Just like that. Do another one just a bit down to hold the panel, just like that. And then we're going to have to hold the other part of it before we take our clamps off. So sometimes what a good example is, when you're trying to bridge a bit of a gap, instead of holding it straight up and down how you would for these nice thin ones, just lay it on its side a little bit, so you're trying to overlap both sheets of steel, and same procedure. In this case I didn't quite bridge the whole bit, but I did set up a weld spot on one side, so if you just go to the other sheet, and now our tack's formed, just like that. Take the clamps off, and now you want to do your first initial test fit to make sure that it is welded in straight. You don't want to have it bobbing up and down, because that's just going to warp the rest of the metal if you get it too hot. So I can feel just with my finger that I've got it a nice, it's the correct alignment between the two panels, so I'm happy to continue the rest of my weld spots. First thing I generally want to do is close off these corners so they don't move. A good tip for that I was saying a good tip to that is to get yourself a heat sink. If you're ever going to blow holes in the steel, it'll be in the corner, because there's not as much metal for the heat to dissipate in. So this is just a piece of alloy, it's pretty grubby. You can use copper or whatever, but I just had a few pieces of alloy. So hold it underneath, hold it there, right into the corner, and we've tacked it. Same in the other corner where we've got more of a space. Nice and simple. Always do those first. Don't run the weld pull down towards the edge, and you'll just blow it away. And in the corners, I like to push it right up hard against the corner, and tack it off that way. Now, I like to have it tacks every, say, 2 centimeters. That there was probably an example of how not to run your bead. That was my mistake. I didn't give it enough of a push, and the weld started to splatter and was a bit cold, so I have to go back and do it again. And you can tell when it's sizzling, you know you're welding it correctly. Sometimes what I like doing is, if I run a whole heap of tacks down, just take your grinder and just slightly grind down each of the tacks so they're flat, so you can run your proper weld beads. Right, I've just run the grinder over the top of them just to take down the crown of the welds. Now you're going to start running your weld beads to weld up the rest of the panel. My advice is to start and end on an existing weld, and make sure it's nice and hot when you do it. If you do it that way, you're less likely to form pinholes in between where you've run your weld pulls, and of course you can only run a weld maybe 1 centimetre, 1.5 centimetres before you're going to start warping the rest of the steel. Especially if the panel is very flat, you'll warp it really easy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start running a strip of weld. Probably going to start here on this tack. When you hear it sizzling, you know you can continue on the rest of it and finish it. When you see the weld starting to flatten out, see the weld pull flatten out and get really red, you know that you're just about to blow through the steel, so stop then. So we'll start through now. I'll run 2 lines, run it, let it cool, run it again and finish. And there you can see the weld that I've just run. I'll zoom in a bit on that. Okay, that's what it looks like. Now you run your next one, probably over here, just so you don't put too much heat in the panel, and just go the whole way around. I'll show you what I do for when I've got these slightly thick bits. What you can do is come in, if the gap's running this way, come in behind it and just spot it. Sometimes you've got to spot it on each side to melt the two panels together, like this. Just like that. And you can see that I've just melted these two panels in between by running the weld right down the middle of the gap there. And I'll continue the rest of it and show you how it ended up. I mean by a flat disc. This is a flat disc, just wee bits of sandpaper on the grinding stone. It smooths out where you're grinding it, doesn't leave these gouges like the stone does. And I'll show you how that finishes up. There's the finished product. Pretty much no undercutting, barely any pinholes. Pretty happy with this weld. I know it's going to be a good one. I'll just lay some sandpaper over it so you can see the finish properly. I can't see it really any better, but it's pretty much back to parent steel. You can barely see the weld, and that's like how I like to have it. Sometimes it's good to look at the back of the panel where you're doing your repair, just to make sure that your penetration's good. So here you can see pretty much equal penetration as to what was on the front side when I was running the welds. So this knows that I've got my settings pretty much where I want to be, and my weld pulls are going nice and deep into the steel. You want to see weld on both sides, because that shows you've got good penetration and you haven't got a tinfoil thickness worth of weld holding to the two sheets together. So I hope this has helped someone out there. Like I say, the only way you're ever going to get good at this is to try it, and that's pretty much what I did. I just jumped in, practiced on a few bits, figured out what works best for me and what works best for the welds, and went from there. So hope you enjoyed this YouTube. Give us a shout out if you want to see anything else. Cheers.